Welcome back to Parking Full Time. I am Big Dave, the Parks Professor, and I want to specifically welcome you to this Bible study and prayer time. The goal of Parking Full Time is to display the glory of God's creation by exploring America one park at a time. The theme verse of Parking Full Time is Colossians 1:16, which says that all things were created by Him and for Him. The hiking videos on this channel are designed to display the created by Him part, and these Bible study and prayer time videos are designed to explore the created for Him part. Right now we're studying through the Gospel of John, and in this video we're going to look at John chapter 13. The previous chapter, John chapter 12, was kind of a transition chapter. It marked, in some sense, the end of Jesus' public ministry, his public teaching, his public healings, and his public arguings in some cases. It also marked the beginning of the sequence of events that will lead to his death, burial, and resurrection. And the next few chapters, starting with chapter 13 here, cover what we sometimes call the Last Supper, where Jesus meets privately with his disciples to celebrate the Jewish Passover feast or observe the Jewish Passover feast, and also to give them some last instructions before he goes to die on the cross. And of the four gospel writers, John is the only one to record most of the private conversations that we're going to be looking at over the next few chapters. And I and many Christians through the years have been really glad that John wrote what he wrote. I personally have gotten a lot of comfort and a lot of advice from these next few chapters, and I hope that you'll get that through these videos as we study these chapters as well. We're going to go through chapter 13 verse by verse like I usually do, but the main thing in this chapter, and in some sense the main thing in the entire Last Supper discourse, is at the end of chapter 13 here. So I want to start there to keep the main thing. So let's start by looking at John chapter 13 and look at verses 34 and 35 here, down towards the end of the chapter. And Jesus says to his disciples here, he says to them, "A new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another. As I have loved you, that ye also love one another. By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if ye have love one to another." 3 times here, he gives them the main thing in this chapter, and again, really the main thing in this entire Last Supper discourse. 3 times he tells them to love one another. I'm going to box all 3 of those times. So right here, he says it once, love one another, in John chapter 13 and verse 34. He says it again at the very end of that verse, love one another. And then he says it a 3rd time, right down here in verse 35. It says, "By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if ye have love one to another." So I'll box it the 3rd time it appears, right here at the end of verse 35. So 3 times Jesus tells his disciples in this private setting in the upper room while they're observing the Passover feast, 3 times he tells them to love one another. When we think of love, sometimes we think of romance and emotions, and love can involve that. There's nothing wrong with that. But Jesus is going to show us in this chapter, and the Bible tells us elsewhere, that that kind of a love, a purely emotional, erotic love, that's not biblical love. Biblical love isn't just an emotion. When he says love one another here, he's not just talking about our emotions. Biblical love is caring for one another. Biblical love is an attitude expressed through actions. You can't really love someone without doing things to meet their needs, without doing things to show them that you care for them. And Jesus is going to show us that here in this chapter, in chapter 13. And 3 times at the end of the chapter, he tells to his disciples, love one another. Now, if God says something once, that's enough that we should do it because he's God. If he says it twice, well, that means that's a pretty important thing. He's really serious that we should be doing that. Here he says it 3 times in a row, and he's going to say it a few more times over the next few chapters here in the Last Supper discourse. The point is, it's really, really important that we love one another. It's really, really important that we as believers care for one another. And so now you know where Jesus is going with this. Let's go back to the beginning of the chapter, and let's look at the entire chapter now and see how he gets there. So let's go back to the beginning of John chapter 13 and start reading in verse 1. Verse 1 says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end." Notice this chapter starts with something very important here. It starts with this phrase here, he loved them unto the end. In the Greek, in the original text that John wrote, literally it says, he loved them to the uttermost. That's the phrase that's translated, loved them to the end here. That is, he loved them as much as anyone could love them. And I made this point a couple of chapters ago, but Jesus was someone who really loved people. He loved people unto the end. He loved people to the uttermost. We saw that a couple of chapters ago, back in John chapter 11 and verse 5. And we'll go back, we studied this a couple of videos ago, but we'll go back and look at it again. John chapter 11 and verse 5. Trying to emphasize the point here, Jesus really loved people. Loving people was really important to Jesus. Back here at the beginning of John chapter 11, so we met this family, so 2 sisters, Mary and Martha, and then their brother Lazarus. And notice what it says about them here. In John chapter 11, verse 5, it says, "Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus." Jesus loved these people. He loved Lazarus, whom he would raise from the dead later in chapter 11, as we studied a few weeks ago. And he shows his love. He showed his love for Lazarus and also for Mary and Martha when he rose Lazarus from the dead. Jesus wept when Lazarus died. He was very human. He showed his love for Lazarus with these actions. John 3:16, perhaps the most famous verse in the Bible, says that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. God's love, his care for everyone in the world motivated him to action. It motivated him to send his Son to die on the cross for the sins of the world, to pay for my sin, for your sin, and for the sin of anyone who will believe in him. And here now at the beginning of chapter 13, it says, he loved his own, that is, he loved his disciples, and he loved them unto the end. He loved them as much as he could possibly love them. And he's going to show his love. He's going to show his love for his disciples here over the next few verses. Let's keep reading. That's verse 1. Look at verse 2. And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. I'll say more about that later here in the chapter. Verse 3. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he was come from God and went to God, he riseth from the supper, and laid aside his garments, and took a towel, and girded himself. After he poureth water into a basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. Now, you need a little bit of cultural context to understand what Jesus was doing here, and the message that his disciples would have understood when they saw him doing this. Israel's a desert country. And back in Jesus' day, when they traveled by foot, the only real footwear that they had was sandals. They didn't have nice foot-covering shoes and hiking boots like we do today. And so when you traveled somewhere by foot, and you got to the end of your hike, so to speak, and arrived at your destination, your feet would be dusty and dirty from the dust and dirt on the trail that collects on your feet because of the sandals. I know sometimes when I get done with a hike, my shoes are really dusty and dirty, if it's been that kind of a hike, especially a desert hike. And normally what would happen, the host at wherever they arrived at, normally the host would assign a servant who had water and a towel, like Jesus takes on here. And he would assign that servant to clean the travelers' feet when they arrived, to wash the dust and dirt off their feet so that they would be cleaner, so that they would be more comfortable, so that his guests would be more comfortable. Well, here the host didn't do that. And nobody volunteered to do it. And so Jesus volunteered. He volunteered to do a job normally done by a servant. And usually when this text is taught, I've heard this text taught a large number of times. And usually when this text is taught in the context of service, and that's right, it's right to do that. But notice what's driving Jesus' service here. Notice what's driving him to take on the towel and take on the water basin and do the job of a servant. What's motivating it is the fact that he loved them. He loved his disciples unto the end. The fact that he loved them to the uttermost. His love is being expressed through his actions. And that's the way it always is. Love is an attitude expressed through actions. The service he's doing for them here, he's showing his love for them. Now, some of his disciples didn't get that at this point. We see that in the next few verses. Look at verse 6 here. Then cometh he to Simon Peter, and Peter saith unto him, Lord, dost thou wash my feet? Jesus answered and said unto him, What I do thou knowest not now, but thou shalt know hereafter. You see, Jesus knew that his disciples, they didn't get his message about loving and serving one another right now. They didn't get it yet, but they would later. They would after he gave them some more instructions. And Peter proves he doesn't get it right now with what he says next. Look here in verses 8 and 9. And Peter saith unto him, Thou shalt never wash my feet. Jesus answered him. Note that the other disciples didn't object to Jesus washing their feet, but Peter did. Peter said very forcefully, Thou shalt never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, If I wash thee not, thou hast no part with me. And Simon Peter saith unto him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Again, we kind of laugh at that, and it's kind of funny, but Simon Peter, he didn't get it at this point. He didn't get what Jesus was trying to show him through this attitude expressed through actions. And in Peter's responses here, the two things that Peter says, we see an interesting mix of humility and pride. On one hand, in verse 8, he tells Jesus, you shouldn't be washing my feet. You're too good for this job. And he was. Jesus was the Lord of all. So on one hand, that's Peter's humility there. On the other hand, he then tells him what he can and can't do. That's Peter's pride there. And I know sometimes I'm that way too. I realize that he's God and I'm not. I realize who he is. I realize who I am. And yet I try to tell him what he should do. I make the same mistake Peter does. And that's the wrong way to approach God. You see, Peter doesn't understand the message that Jesus is trying to convey to him yet. But eventually he will. Peter shows later that he does. Let's look at a couple of references here. A couple of references in what Peter wrote later. Let's look, I'll write them in here. Let's look at 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. At my church right now, I'm actually teaching through 1 Peter at my church right now. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. And also let's go and let's take a look at 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 1. So a couple of references of what Peter wrote later on in his life, after he did that show us he did finally get the message here. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 1. So let's go take a look at that. Let's go look at 1 Peter towards the end of the Bible here. Right. So we're here in 1 Peter, and let's look at chapter 3. Let's look at verses 8 and 9, so right over here. And notice what he tells them here. Notice the instructions that he writes to the believers here in 1 Peter. He says, "Finally, be ye all of one mind." And notice what he says here, "having compassion one of another. Love as brethren. Be pitiful. Be concerned for one another. Be courteous, not rendering evil for evil or railing for railing, but contrariwise blessing, as opposed to rendering evil for evil, render blessing, knowing that ye are thereunto called, that ye should inherit a blessing." So he tells them here, have compassion one of another. And that's just a different way of saying love one another. He explicitly says that, love as brethren, love each other, love other believers as you would love your own brother. And then it also comes up at the very beginning of 1 Peter. Notice how or 2 Peter, the very beginning of 2 Peter. Notice how he describes himself here. At the very beginning of 2 Peter, the very first verse, he says here, at the very beginning of 2 Peter, he says, Simon Peter, and notice the first word he uses to describe himself now, as he gets towards the end of his life. Simon Peter, a servant and an apostle of Jesus Christ. See, Peter didn't understand the point that Jesus was making back in John chapter 13. He didn't understand that at that time, but he figured it out. He figured out the need to love one another. He figured out the need to be a servant. He figured out the importance of loving people and showing it through your service. And I know in times past, there were times when I didn't understand. And I certainly didn't put into practice the point that Jesus was making. The need to love one another, the need to show that through your service. But I'm hoping I'm figuring it out. And I hope you are too. I'm hoping you're figuring out the same thing that Peter eventually figured out. The need to love one another, and the need to show that love through your service. Now, back in John, so we see that Peter didn't get it at this time, but Jesus doesn't give up. He keeps trying to explain it to him. Look here at verse 10. Jesus saith unto him, He that is washed needeth not save to wash his feet, but is clean every whit. And ye are clean, but not all. For he knew who should betray him. Therefore said he, Ye are not all clean. Again, that's a reference to Judas Iscariot, and I'll say more about that in a few minutes here. Okay. Look at verse 12. Verse 12 says, So after he had washed their feet, and had taken his garments, and was set down again, he said unto them, Know ye what I have done to you? And that's a rhetorical question. The implied answer is no, partly as evidenced by what Peter said to Jesus back up here in verses 8 and 9. But he's getting ready to explain it. All right, so he understands that no, they don't realize the message he's trying to convey. So he explains it to him. So look, starting here in verse 13. Ye call me Master and Lord, and ye say, Well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, ye also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that ye should do as I have done to you. And when he talks here about washing one another's feet, it's not really the physical act of washing someone's feet that's the core of his point here. He's talking about loving one another and talking about showing that love by serving them. He is the Master and the Lord. He is God the Son and the Son of God. He has been God since eternity past. There wasn't a point where he became God at some point. He's always been God. He is Master and Lord. Yet he's loving them. And he's serving them rather than forcing them and dictating to them like the masters and lords of this world tend to do. You see, Christian leadership is servant leadership. Because in the eyes of God, we're all on the same level. You see, the Bible tells us we've all sinned. We've all done things that God's told us not to do. and failed to do things that God has told us to do. The Bible also says the penalty for that sin is death, spiritual death, eternal separation from God. But the Bible goes on to say that we can have everlasting life. We can have our death penalty that we owe paid for by believing in him. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. And all of us who have done that, all of us who have believed in him, really, we're on the same level. We're sinners saved by God's grace. And you can go on and do great service and great leadership for the Lord, and that's a good thing to do. But in the end, we're all just sinners saved by grace. We're all on the same level. And Jesus says that here in the next verse. Look at verse 16. Verily, verily, truly, truly, that is, you really need to listen to what I'm getting ready to tell you here, because it's true. Verily, verily, I say unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord, neither he that is sent greater than he that sent him. Again, that's not usually the way it works in this world, but with him, that's the way it works. We're all sinners saved by grace. If ye know these things, happy are ye if ye do them. I speak not of you all. I know whom I have chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled, he that eateth bread with me hath lifted up his heel against me. Again, that's a reference to Judas Iscariot, and we'll see that momentarily here. Look at verse 19. Now I tell you before it come, that when it come to pass, ye may believe that I am he. Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that receiveth whomsoever I send receiveth me, and he that receiveth me receiveth him that sent me. Then verse 21, so then we start to see what he was saying here with these, with some of these references I pointed out before. Verse 21, when Jesus had thus said, he was troubled in spirit. So he began to really be troubled, really worried about something, and testified and said, verily, verily, I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. One of you shall betray me. Then the disciples looked one on another, doubting of whom he spake. Now we know, and he knew when he said that in verse 21, he knew he was talking about Judas Iscariot. And we know that from reading the rest of the Gospels. We know that, and he knew that. The disciples had no idea. The disciples looked one on another, doubting of whom he spake. They had no idea who he was. They had no idea who was going to betray him. They had no idea what Judas was about to do here. Okay. And then verse 23, so now there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved. Beside this here, the disciple whom Jesus loved, this is the first time that that phrase is used, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And it's going to appear a few other times here in the Gospel of John. When it talks about the disciple whom Jesus loved, he's talking about John, the writer of this Gospel. Okay? The Bible never explicitly actually tells us that. It never explicitly identifies the disciple who was leaning on Jesus' bosom as John. But most people, including me, think it's John, the writer of this gospel. And there are good reasons for thinking that are too detailed and technical for this video. Right? So they have no idea who Jesus is talking about when he says that someone's going to betray him, and so they decide to ask him. Okay? And so verse 24, Simon Peter therefore beckoned to John, that he should ask who it should be of whom he spoke. Again, they had no idea who it was. So they asked Jesus what he's talking about, who he's talking about. He then, lying on Jesus' breast, saith unto him, Lord, who is it? Probably in a very hushed tone. Jesus answered, again, probably very quietly, He it is, to whom I shall give a sop, when I have dipped it. A sop is a morsel, usually a morsel of bread. It can be a morsel of meat, but usually here especially it's a morsel of bread. Okay? So he it is to whom I shall give a sop when I have dipped it. Okay? And when he had dipped the sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. And if you think about this setting here a little bit, if he gave it to Judas, if he handed it to Judas Iscariot, Judas must have been seated very close to Jesus, possibly in the seat of highest honor. which would have been the seat directly to Jesus' left. See, normally, this act that Jesus does here of giving him a sop, again, a little bit of cultural context, normally the host would do this. The host would give this sop to someone he wanted to honor. In this case, though, because Jesus knew what Judas was getting ready to do, in this case, it's more of a final appeal to Judas. In effect, Jesus is telling him, I care about you. I love you. Don't do what I know you're getting ready to do. That's what he's really saying by giving him this morsel, by giving him this sop here. Sadly, this final appeal, it's rejected. Look at what happens next, verse 27. And after the sop, Satan entered into him. Then said Jesus unto him, That thou doest, do quickly. He realizes that he's not going to be able to talk him out of it, and so he tells him, all right, go do what you're going to do. Go do what you've already decided to do. Now no man at the table knew for what intent he spake this unto him. For some of them thought because Judas had the bag of money that the disciples used to pay their expenses. Some of them thought because Judas had the bag that Jesus had said unto him, Buy those things that we have need of against the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. He then, having received the sop, went immediately out, and it was night. See, Jesus loved Judas Iscariot and all of his disciples. 1 John chapter 4, verse 8. I'll write that in down here. 1 John chapter 4, verse 8. It tells us that God is love. God loves everyone. He wants everyone to trust in him. He wants everyone to have eternal life and to love like he loves, but he won't force you. Judas didn't love Jesus or the other disciples, and he shows that attitude through his actions. Judas loved himself. He only cared about himself. He cared about pilfering money from the disciples' money bag, right? And he cared about getting the 30 pieces of silver that he would get from betraying the Lord. Love isn't just an emotion. Love is an attitude expressed through actions. Jesus and the other disciples, they had it, or they were going to have it. Judas never had it. Let's finish the text here. Now that Judas is gone, now that he's down to just the people, just his true followers, he starts giving them some other instructions. Look at verse 31. Therefore, when he was gone out, Jesus said, Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God be glorified in him, God shall also glorify him in himself, and shall straightway glorify him. I talked a lot about glory and the glory that Jesus had, how his glorification was his death on the cross. I talked a lot about that in the previous video, so I'm not going to talk about that again here. Keep reading in verse 33. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. Ye shall seek me. And as I said unto the Jews, Whither I go, ye cannot come. So now I say to you. He was going to go to the Father where they couldn't go yet. And now the main thing in this entire discourse, and certainly in this chapter, verses 34 and 35, A new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another, as I have loved you, that ye also love one another. By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, that ye have love one to another. He gives them this new commandment here, and it's not really a new commandment, because the Old Testament tells us to love one another, but it's new in its force. It's new in how he loved people. And notice here, Jesus didn't bother to give this commandment to Judas. Judas Iscariot didn't love anyone but himself, and there was no way he was going to keep this commandment. But Jesus did give it to his true disciples, and he has given it to us who have believed in him. I hope you've believed in him. If you haven't believed in him, now's a great time to do that. There's no aisle to walk, there's no prayer to pray, there are no magic words to say. Just stop trusting in whatever else you're trusting in. Stop trusting in yourself and any goodness you think you have. And start trusting in him. Start trusting in him alone. Start trusting in the death payment he paid for your sin on the cross. And if you have done that, I hope you're trying to love people as he loves you. Love people as he has commanded us to do here. For me, I'm a retired math professor. I'm a person of logic and structure. Loving people is very hard for me. I've been trying to get better at that really for about 20 years now. And I've had varying degrees of success at that. But I can tell you, he has helped me. And he'll help you if you'll ask him for his help. As I have loved you, that ye also love one another. We'll pick up there next time. I want to close this video the way I close all of these videos, with a brief prayer time and a brief look at my prayer list here. Some things I'm praying for right now. I'm praying for our country and its leaders. We desperately need that, especially heading into an election year here. I'm praying that more people will believe in him. I'm praying for power and protection for preachers of the gospel. I'm praying that new believers to grow. And in light of what we've studied today, another thing that I'm going to add to my prayer list here, I'm going to pray that believers will love each other, will care for each other. Okay. Honestly, I see a real lack of that in a lot of our churches these days. A lot of churches just seem to have one sentinel issue that they really care about, and it shouldn't be that way. We should keep the main thing the main thing. And the main thing is loving the Lord. The main thing is the gospel, how he loved us, and loving for one another. So I'm going to take a few minutes to pray for these things now. I hope you'll do the same. Until next time, I am Big Dave, the Parks Professor for Parking Full Time. Have a great afternoon, take care, and Lord bless.